Amen. Hello everyone. We're back together again. In our last presentations, we were in a different location. We were just completing the introduction into World War I. So I want to conduct a short revision of what brought us here. And then this afternoon, I hope we can discuss the First World War. It's a subject that, to be done justice, really needs more time than we have, at least double the time that we have. So we're going to try and move fairly quickly. But there are presentations online if there are, by chance, any gaps left to the logic. Before we do that, I want to just address one subject. We know the date today, we know the significance. If we were to think about our reform line, how many US presidents have we had? 5? Where are we starting from? Where do we want to start from, I suppose, would answer our question. Reagan. So we have Reagan. Next president? George Bush Sr. Next president? Next president? George Bush Jr. Next president? Next president? So how many presidents? 6 presidents featuring on our reform line. If we wanted to start talking about these, linking them, let's just say this was a connect the dots kind of puzzle, or I can't think of the name, we'll stick with the connect the dots kind of puzzle. If you wanted to connect these presidents to who they had the most in common with, who would you connect? Start with Clinton. Who do you want to connect Clinton to? Bill Clinton. What kind of man is he? We'll start with the easy. What political party? Democrat. So where do you want to connect? You only have one other Democrat. So you have a Democrat and a Democrat. It's the first link. George Bush Sr., who do you want to connect him to? Father with son. What is this George Bush Sr. known for? What war did he put America into?
Desert Storm.
And Desert Storm was a war with who?
Iraq.
So there's an Iraq war, known as the Gulf War or Desert Storm. The American public, they didn't want this war. What did he have to do to get them, convince them that this was a justified war?
A weapon of mass destruction.
That's an answer to a question we're about to ask. But for the father, similar answer. What did he have done or have done on his watch? They had a young girl stand up in Congress and say how Saddam Hussein had been, how those Iraqi troops in Kuwait had been taking babies from incubators, throwing them on the floor and leaving them to die and stealing the incubators. This was a conspiracy theory that was stirred up to cause the American people to agree with an Iraq war. It was later realized that that poor girl from Kuwait who everyone thought was this poor girl who worked in a hospital and she cried through her testimonies and saw all those awful things. She was actually the ambassador, the daughter of the ambassador of Kuwait to the United States. And she was put there by a firm that was paid hundreds of thousands of dollars to convince the American public for an Iraq war. She was the daughter of the ambassador that was trained for that role. And that's something that's not a conspiracy theory. The US government recognized that the ambassador from Kuwait had orchestrated this show in Congress to convince the American public. So the first Iraq war against Saddam Hussein is all based on lies. Like father, like son. Who is the son going to go to war with? There's going to be another Iraq war. In fact, they called this the Iraq War until this Iraq War, and then they had to think of another word, so they started calling it the Gulf War, or the first Iraq War. This Iraq War, what's it based upon? Brother Molly gave the answer before: weapons of mass destruction. Another conspiracy theory. So like father, like son. One Iraq War, another Iraq War. Father, son, Democrat, Democrat. And we teach in this movement what principle? How do you know what the end looks like? Based on the beginning. We have that all through inspiration on whatever level we want to look at it. We began on the diet of Eden. What are we going to finish on? Began with equality. What are we going to finish on? We see that end from beginning all through inspiration, also all through prophecy, that God illustrates the end from the beginning. So the first president on our reform line, what is he going to look like? The last president on our reform line. So Reagan, what was Reagan's occupation before he became involved in politics? He's a celebrity. He's a television actor, best known for portraying cowboys, but he's a celebrity, an actor. So Reagan, outside the political establishment, he's a celebrity in Hollywood. So you have a celebrity. How does Reagan get elected? So to go back into previous studies, there's a history before Reagan, this 10-year history, and we tied that back to the civil rights movement. You have the civil rights movement in America, people like Martin Luther King Jr. fighting for the end of segregation and the introduction of equality. And within this civil rights movement, they start to force the Christian conservative schools in the southern states of America to desegregate. And they start forcing them to do that through withholding or abolishing tax exemption for any private schools that segregate. And those southern evangelicals, what did they believe about segregation? It's a biblical mandated principle. So for them to desegregate was for them to go against their religious convictions. So they from the very beginning are fighting against the civil rights movement. It's that exact same mentality in the South that 100 years before that used the Bible to justify slavery. They used the Bible to justify slavery. 100 years later, they used the Bible to justify segregation. And when the state starts to prevent them from segregating their private Christian academies, they all come together, they all unite in an organization known as the Moral Majority. Go onto YouTube and you'll find the people involved in that speaking about it openly. They formed an organization called the Moral Majority, the leading evangelicals of the time, and their purpose was to turn the evangelical leaders and the evangelical church from being just a religious organization to activate it politically, with the intent in mind that they would unite with which party of the US government? Republican. They didn't unite with both. They chose the Republican Party. It had the same, closest to the same ideals as they had, with the Republican concept of the civil rights movement. So they all unite. In 1979, they form the moral majority. They start turning those evangelical churches into really tools of political activism. They start calling on their church members to vote. And we've, in past presentations, we read through all the quotes straight from their mouth where they speak about how they want to reshape the United States after Christian principles. And they're going to do that through the US government. Just another way of saying, break down the separation of church and state, make church, use the state to enforce the morality of the majority. And the majority being the evangelical churches in America. So the moral majority, who led that charge? What evangelical leader led that charge? Jerry Falwell. Jerry Falwell was a leading evangelical who led that charge. Extremely conservative, deeply set into racism. So connected to this, with their issues with the civil rights movement, you also have this white nationalism. And we read quotes of Jerry Falwell where he spoke in anger that you had communities in the cities where you had friends of his, nice white families, friends of his, passed a friend and a black couple moved next door, and the anger he had about that you would have these communities where black couples were moving next to white couples. So you have this connection to white nationalism. And then with this white nationalism, connected to this evangelical charge known as the moral majority, you also have this end of the Cold War. And as the Cold War ended, what kind of power did the United States become? We use the term unilateral. And in prior presentations, we've gone through the three different types of powers: unilateral, bilateral, multilateral. Unilateral, bilateral, multilateral. In a unilateral world order, how many superpowers do you have? One. In a bilateral, how many? Two. In a multilateral? Many. So we see that at the beginning of our reform line, the world goes from what type of order to what type of order? Goes from bilateral to unilateral. It goes from two world superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, to one world superpower, unilateral system, just the United States as the world superpower, what really became quite quickly a world dictatorship until they were again restrained. We're going to discuss this history of 1989 to 91 and what that looked like. Who wanted a multilateral world? Gorbachev. So in this history, when we talk about 1989, you have the world going into what you could call a new world order. The new world order is bilateralism, changing into a different type of lateralism. Gorbachev called for multilateralism, and the United States called for unilateralism. So you have two world superpowers. Gorbachev says if the Soviet Union isn't going to be a superpower, then we just have to have many superpowers because we can't have the United States having that much control. So this is Gorbachev. That's his type of world order. That's what he wants. What's another word for multilateral? Globalism. So Gorbachev, the end of the Cold War, starts talking about a new world order. And when he says a new world order, he sees that the time in which the world is bilateral, with the Soviet Union and the United States holding each other in check, is coming to an end. And as it is coming to an end, Gorbachev starts to speak about his desire for a new world order. A new world order where the UN and globalists run the world's affairs. Is this what happened? No. Around the time Gorbachev starts talking about this new world order, you have, heading into the time of George Bush Sr., he steals this term of Gorbachev's because he publicly stated, particularly later in his autobiography, publicly stated he would never accept a multilateral world. Why? Because he said there is no substitute for American leadership. He wanted a unilateral world order. So Gorbachev starts talking about this multilateral world run by the United Nations, what we would term globalism. This dies in the water because as the United States becomes the world superpower in the 1989-1991 history, they steal that phrase from Gorbachev, New World Order, and they give it another definition, so they subtly twist it. September 11 of 1990, George Bush does his speech in Congress titled Towards a New World Order. And what he does is he takes Gorbachev's definition of the New World Order and says that's well and good, but we're not going to accept that type of world order. There is no substitute for American leadership. And from now on, they're determined to have a unilateral world order. So this is where Adventism starts to trip up, because so much of our definitions, especially as Adventism has imbibed the conspiracy theories of Walter Weiss, we keep saying this is the threat, that somehow globalism and the UN are the threat, and that is what defines the New World Order. But this was Gorbachev's idea, and he was just the dying king of a dying kingdom. The United States reinvented it, and it's unilateralism, or what you would call nationalism, a one-world superpower. So that's an introduction, brief introduction to the history of the 1989-1991 New World Order that begins to be introduced. As we go into our application of the two world wars, we're going to discuss that history, which is why we need this revision. But you see that in this history, with Reagan and Bush, the world is heading into this new world order, this nationalistic world order that is headed or led by a largely unrestrainable United States. So if this is how our reform line begins, how is it going to end?
Same.
The same. Donald Trump, is he part of the political establishment? No. What was his job function before he became the President of the United States? We could say businessman. He'd actually stopped doing proper business deals long before. He made most of his money off television and reality shows. He was a celebrity. He comes out of Hollywood. He comes out of Hollywood. Jerry Falwell united the religious right because of their racism to elect Reagan with the majority of the white evangelical vote. 2016, early on, not many evangelical leaders have endorsed Donald Trump. There's been a sense of fear to do that until one man stands up and says, I'm endorsing him and you all have to endorse him too. And who was that? Jerry Falwell Jr. Father, son. 2016, Jerry Falwell Jr. endorses Donald Trump, leads the evangelical world into unity on that subject, and wins Donald Trump the presidency with 81% of the evangelical vote. Celebrity elected by this evangelical drive driven by white nationalism. And what do we expect to see? What do we already see signs of happening? It's heading back to a nationalistic world order And we know prophecy foretells it will be unilateral. And as we've been saying throughout the year, we need to let go of our conspiracy theories that call globalism the threat. Globalism is the restraint, not the threat. So when we see our reform line and we see the structure, we know that God works by telling us the end from the beginning. So you see the connection with Bush and Bush, with Clinton and Obama. But if you want to understand Trump, the first place to go back to is Ronald Reagan. See how he was elected, what type of man he was, how he got elected, and what eventuated from his election. The fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of the King of the South, the fall of the King of the South, the completion of Daniel 11 verse 40. So this is one structure for this. We can also see in this structure just why it had to be Donald Trump who won the 2016 election. We were saying earlier in 2016, we knew that whatever president won that race, they would be the last president of the United States. We'd identified that prophetically. And then we come to the days before the vote, the days before November 8 and 9, 2016, and who were we saying would win? Some places were bold enough to say Donald Trump, but many areas of the movement failed, and they were saying it could be either. Why? Because Clinton is UN connected, George Soros connected, Rothschild connected, globalist. And we still had our conspiracy theories. They blinded us from being able to identify that it could not be anyone other than Donald Trump. Because we were still holding on to that baggage, we could not see clearly who had to win that election. And the structure tells us it was a Republican that brought about church and state in this history, Republican in 2001 with 9/11 and the Patriot Act. It was the Republican government even in the Obama years of 2014 that did that work. So we should have known that the party that has begun to work with the Protestant churches of America is the Republican Party. The structure tells us that it had to be Donald Trump. In the last few days, our movement, now that we've had this shaking and those of us who used to be among us have left, I keep feeling like it's turning into a bit of the tabloids. I keep finding out things about myself that I didn't know about. So apparently I'm autistic and all kinds of things. So it's quite a surprise. But one thing that they are attacking this movement with is they're saying that I predicted last year that Donald Trump would be impeached, removed from office on November 9 this year. So Elder Jeff, FFA particularly, are saying that I made this prediction that Donald Trump would be impeached, and by impeached, completely removed from office, and that he would be impeached on November 9, which is today or about to be today in the United States. The problem that they're having in attacking us is, what did we say about the messages? The first angel's message, the second angel's message, the third angel's message. If you reject the first, can you be benefited by the second? No. If you reject the second, therefore, can you be benefited by the third? No. The problem they have is they rejected in 2012. This shaking, this split has been 7 years in the making. It's prophetic. It's not moral. It's not a disagreement between people who don't get along. It's a prophetic issue 7 years in the making. And because they could not be benefited by the second angel's message that was formalized in 2012, when we come to this history, it's not just that they can't be benefited by it. Elder Jeff has said that from the time I started presenting last October, not only did he intentionally pay no attention to what I was teaching, he very quickly stopped watching me altogether. So most of what I have taught this year, he has never watched. And what I taught at the very beginning that he may have watched, He has said that he intentionally did not pay attention to those presentations. So now he comes to a time when he wants to attack what I'm saying, and the problem he has is he doesn't actually know what I'm saying. So first of all, they have to invent our message so they actually have a message they can attack. This is why we keep finding things, we keep finding out that they're saying certain things that we've never said. They stopped listening to the message a long time ago, and the reason why they just couldn't even watch it, I would suggest, is because of this issue. It's been years in the development. So most of those people who have left, they reject the message of the two streams of information presented last October and throughout the year. And the issue they have with it is that when you address the subject of two streams of information, you make the subject very clear. Without thinking morality, like morally good, morally bad, Trump is bad, Clinton is good. And when you come to this 2016 election, we teach that it had to be Trump. And they reject that. They would say this could be Trump or Clinton, they're both as wicked as each other, prophetically. We teach it had to be Trump. He's the only one that fits the prophetic narrative. So based on our understanding that it had to be Trump, why would we teach that he's going to be removed from office? We're the ones saying the last president had to be Trump. It can be no other. So that I want us to see, even just on this simple chiasm, this simple structure, not how we knew that Trump was the last president, we had other logic for that, but just how the structure supports that. That end from beginning, you have the perfect picture. So in answer to those who are perhaps hearing these things and confused, I've never taught that Donald Trump would be impeached November 9. What I did say last year is that based on the 151 and our understanding of time spans, that from October last year, I said on tape, this year Donald Trump has to be impeached. Prophecy shows us Donald Trump would face an impeachment proceeding. An impeachment does not mean someone is removed from office. We used for this logic the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Who, in 1858, was the first US president ever impeached. That does not mean he was removed from office. All that it means is impeachment proceedings. So we used this understanding of 1858, our understanding of the 151-year principle, 2019, and we made the claim that in this year, in 2019, Donald Trump would face impeachment proceedings, one of the many things that we expected that has been and is being fulfilled. But to say that he is removed from office is a fabrication of our message. There is no prophetic license for that. This movement, more than any other group, recognises exactly who Donald Trump is prophetically. We are not expecting his removal. So I wanted to do this for two reasons. First of all, to give us this picture, so we can see Donald Trump connected to Ronald Reagan, and just in this simplistic a way, see the connection between Reagan and Trump, how much of their histories start to line up. The second reason that I wanted to briefly mention this was to again mention the history of the Gulf War, that first Iraq War with Saddam Hussein. Because as we go into the history of World War I, we must revise that. Just to remind us of a second prophetic principle that we use, the triple application of prophecy. How do we know what the third woe looks like? Because it isn't described in the Bible. How do we know what it looks like? Triple application of prophecy. First woe plus the second woe equals the third woe. Simple mathematics. The first plus the second equals the third. Can anyone think of any others? Sorry? Elijah? First Elijah, second Elijah. We have... Sorry, sister? We have a few ones in history, but we use the triple application of prophecy. The first woe plus the second woe teaches us what the third woe looks like. So we've recognised for a long time that to understand the final war between the king of the north and the king of the south at the end of the world, a world war has to be World War I plus World War II equals World War III. Again, what was the threat in World War I or World War II? Was it globalism? Multilateralism? No, you had a unilateral superpower that started to act like a global bully or a global policeman. Germany in both histories, and we've gone into the history of Germany. We've seen the Millerite history, 1798 to 1844. 46-year history. You start to see the resurrection, the coming up of modern Israel. Connected that to 1899 to 1945, this first attempt to resurrect modern Babylon. First and second angel's message, the history of 1798 to 1844. The history of the First and Second World War, 1899 to 1945. First angel's message, not public knowledge in 1798. William Miller is either 16 or 18 in 1798. It takes years for him to start studying that message. 1899, World War I, the groundwork was laid for that with the First Hague Conference. Takes years before it begins, but you can trace it to these dates. 46 years of modern Israel, 46 years of modern Babylon. There's an overthrow within the leadership of Protestantism, of God's church, as you see a new leadership take up that mantle. Adventism. You see a new leadership rise up within the Catholic Church, overthrow it, reconstruct it under Pope Pius XII. So we've made all those parables between the true and the counterfeit. And in this history, we recognise the significance of World War I and World War II. Impact they had globally, and the impact they also had within the churches. So in our last presentations, before we closed yesterday, we had a revision of the history of World War II. So I just want to lay out what our conclusion was. In the Iron Age, what type of weapons did they fight with? In the Stone Age, what type of weapons? Stone. The Bronze Age, bronze weapons. What age are we in? What age are we in?
Technology, information age.
Information age. And what year was the information age's Big Bang? 1989, the invention of the World Wide Web. So we're in the information age, and it's an information war. You fought with stone weapons in the Stone Age. In the information age, they fight with information weapons. That's a whole nother study. I'm just reminding us of the conclusion. Then we went to the history of Pyrrhus. So if you turned to Daniel 11 verse 4, Daniel 11 verse 4. Same history is in 8:8, but we'll go to 11 verse 4. We'll read from verse 3 and 4. And a mighty king shall stand up. Who is that? Who's the mighty king that stands up? Alexander the Great. That shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. And when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken and shall be divided towards the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others beside those. So in verse 3 and 4, it gives us the history of Alexander the Great and his death. And after his death, his kingdom is divided up between four generals. So he dies in 323 BC. And how accurate, historically accurate, does that account seem? I would suggest it's not that accurate. If you were to go to the death of Alexander in 323 BC, how many parts is his empire divided into? Many. There are dozens of generals that splinter his kingdom. And then over 2 wars, the first and the second war, there's 4 wars altogether. Over 4 wars, known as the Wars of the Diadochi, those many generals start to quarrel over that territory until the number goes down to 5 in 316 BC. So in 323, Alexander dies, and there are many generals. From 323 to 316, how many years is that? It's about 7 years. For about 7 years, there are many generals. They quarrel, they war against each other with over the first 2 Diadochi wars until in 316 BC, there are left only 5 key generals. Prior to this, they'd been fighting against a general known as Eumenes. Eumenes dies, and at the death of Eumenes, one general becomes the most powerful of any after the death of Alexander that existed in that kingdom, Antigonus. Antigonus was so powerful, the other 4, remember we have 5 generals, the other 4 united to oppose him, and those 4 were Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, the 4 that comprise the 4 winds of heaven. These are our 4 famous generals. But in 316 BC, there are not 4, there are 5. Antigonus being so powerful that he's equal in strength to the 4 of these combined. So from 316 BC to 301 BC, these 4 generals in an alliance known as the Allies fight against this most powerful general, Antigonus. And how many years is that? 15. This being the Battle of Ipsus. The Battle of Ipsus, Antigonus was killed, and we have the kingdom divided into the 4 winds of heaven. For how many years was it divided into 4? Around 297, Cassander dies. How many generals do you have now? 3. How many years is that? 4 years. And then after that, for a long time, there's 3 generals. So this is what the history of after the death of Alexander looked like. You have the death of Alexander, 7 years of many generals fighting over a completely splintered empire until 316 when there's 5. Then you have 15 years of war between the most powerful Antigonus and these other 4 generals. In 301 at the Battle of Ipsus, the empire is divided into the 4 winds of heaven as Daniel predicts. It's only divided into 4 for maximum 4 years. Some people place the death of Cassander in 298, which means it was only divided into 4 for this tiny blip of time in the history of the fall of that empire. Before, for many years, it's 3 generals. So Daniel takes this history and he treats it like a parable. The only reason he could possibly have to skip the most momentous events, the most powerful general of that time, and go straight from one king, Alexander, to 4 generals who become kings, Cassander, Lysimachus, Seleucus, and Ptolemy, to skip all of that other history, to skip the long period of time where there's 3 and just go straight to Seleucus and Ptolemy and the 2. The only reason he can have to do that is because he's creating a parable. He wants to give us a particular prophetic framework. When he gives us that particular prophetic framework, we use it as a parable. And we understand now that we can have four winds of heaven. We get our understanding of the king of the north, of the king of the south, and of east and of west. It gives us all of this prophetic significance. So that's why Daniel would go into this history and just go 323, none of this exists, 301, none of that exists, and then there's two generals left. He wants to give us a particular prophetic parable, and that's just typical. It's a perfect example of how you create a parable from a history. Daniel can look at this history through God's leading and say, I don't care about these 4 wars. I don't care about this incredibly powerful general. I don't care about the 15 years or the 22 years. I want to create a prophetic narrative. All of that becomes noise, irrelevant to his story, and he'll just go from 1 to 4 to 2. Through our understanding of the world wars, what we did is we went back into this history, and we did that through Acts 27 and an understanding of Pyrrhus. We understood that this Fourth Diadochi War led us into what history and application? The Fourth Diadochi War took us to World War II. The Fourth Diadochi War was Antigonus, the superpower, versus what were known even at that time as the Allied forces. World War II, the Fourth Diadochi War, and we connected those two and made the application that you saw in the last presentations. But I also introduced us to this point. We know that the triple application of prophecy dictates that the First World War plus the Second must equal the Third. And when we made that application of World War II, what dates did it take us to? We saw 1989, and in 1989 you have the fall of the King of the South, and what's the next waymark on that reform line? The application of World War II. The next waymark on the reform line was 2014, and we placed in 2014 that the King of the North and the King of the South would work together, go into an alliance for the purpose of the 2016 election, typified in the history of Pyrrhus as a war or a battle. This one from up here, Ipsus most directly connecting with 2016. And we haven't reviewed that here, but I can recommend the right presentations that break that battle down and demonstrate its really from two different perspectives, its complete breakdown of the 2016 election. So it goes from 1989 to 2014 to 2016. 2014 being the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of World War II. 2016 was what in World War II? The invasion of Poland. Beginning World War II on which front? How many fronts exist in World War II? 2 fronts. There's a Western Front and an Eastern Front. 2016 began the history of the application of World War II on what front? The Western Front. 2019, Operation Barbarossa. World War II on what front? Eastern Front. And what type of weapons are used today? Information war, information weapons. So if you turn on your news, and since 2014 it looks like it's so much more volatile, it looks like a war zone. If you went back to Obama years, those were the years of peace compared to what you see if you turn on the news now. And the reason why you turn on the news and you see particularly the political situation in the United States, but across the world, the rise of nationalistic governments, whether it's with Brexit or with Bolsonaro in Brazil, with all of these nationalistic governments who are in their own way uniting church and state in their own countries, Modi in India, if you start to see the chaos, the battleground that is politics today across the world, you can know why it looks so chaotic. You're looking at the war on the Western Front. There's two fronts to this war. It's not all Russia and the United States. It is the United States against the United States, and the United States against the West and against their former allies. There's the Western Front that we've been following for a few years now, and there's the Eastern Front. And we know that the Eastern Front will look a lot like the Western Front. So this was our understanding of World War II in a nutshell. And what did we say was the problem? There's 25 years of a 30-year reform line that's missing. And we made the application, came to the conclusion that for a proper triple application of prophecy, we understand now World War II, we have to have a prophetic understanding of what World War I has to teach us. When we went back into this period is what Acts 27 and the history of Pyrrhus took us to, that led us to World War II originally. The Fourth War brought us to World War II. And the suggestion I would make, the reminder first, is that this Third War, as well as the Fourth War, was a war between Antigonus and the Allied forces. So the Third and the Fourth Diadochi War had all the same players. Antigonus, the superpower, against the Allied forces, and all that they had was an armistice in the middle. The Third Diadochi War, Antigonus goes to war against the Allies. Then the war stops. They go into an armistice. They have a few years of peace. And then the war restarts in the history of the Fourth Diadochi War. If the fourth is the second, where's the first? World War I. You have Germany versus an Eastern and a Western front. That comes to an end. You have a period of peace before it all starts up again. World War I and World War II were one war with an armistice in the middle. And World War II was a direct result of World War I. This is one war with the same parties fighting. This is one war with the same parties fighting. So before we go into the history of World War I to apply it to our time, I want us to first look at this Third Diadochi War. The Fourth plus World War II taught us of our own history today. The Third Diadochi War and World War I will both teach us of our history today, and they'll fill in the 25-year gap we have before the application of World War II. So I'm going to rub this out, and then in the limited time we have left, because we do not have the time to go into the detail we would have, I want us to look at the history of the Third Diadochi War and then World War I. I've said before that in the Millerite history, it's the first and the second angel's messages that in those 46 years prepared God's people to do a work that they failed to accomplish. In the 46 years of the rise of modern Babylon, in that history, 1899 to 1945, you had two world wars that resulted in 1945, a bit of disappointment, and they failed to do the work. But we understand that World War I and World War II had significance for the papacy in that time. They essentially resurrected the papacy, and yet, like the Millerites, they failed to bring that work to a completion. So when we come to our own history, we expect to see within our own reform line not just World War II but also World War I that will give us more detail. So we'll first go into the Third Diadochi War. as an introduction to that, part of the difficulty with teaching this is trying to connect the history, because the history, even the recent history, can really cause quite a migraine. So I'm going to quickly, before going into that, give some history of what led up to 1989. So this is 1989. We talk about a history prior to it. That's how long? A 10-year history. And what do we place here? It's 10 years. We talked before of the moral majority. When was the moral majority formed? Moral majority, 1979. When did they dissolve? 1989. They said they'd accomplished their purpose, they'd got Reagan elected, then they got George Bush elected. And Jerry Falwell said, I accomplished what I set out to do. So the moral majority was a 10-year movement from 79 to 89. We talk about Daniel 11 verse 40 and a proxy war. Afghanistan war, when did it begin? And it ended? We don't talk a whole lot in our movement about Iran, but I can guarantee you it has a place. We have to understand Iran. And if we understand Iran, it went through a revolution that turned itself around. When was the Iran's revolution? 1979. But there was another revolution in the same year. It's that revolution that I want us to see. 1979 was another revolution in what country? Iraq. In 1979, there's a revolution inside Iraq that places what dictator? Saddam Hussein. He takes power in 1979, and immediately with these two events, with this Iranian revolution and Saddam Hussein within Iraq, the Middle East is destabilized, and that they, on two different factions within Islam, begin to war against each other. And Iraq goes to war with Iran. Now, Iraq goes to war with Iran through the history of 1979 through the 1980s. And who supported Iraq in this war? Iraq was supported by the United States. It was supported also by Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. So Saddam Hussein, for those first years, was an ally of the United States, and the United States armed and assisted him in that war against Iran. Partly because this is still the history of the Cold War, and Iran had sided with who?
Russia.
With Russia, with the Soviet Union. Because Iran had sided with the Soviet Union and was an ally of theirs, the United States naturally supported Iraq and wanted to see Iran overthrown. So throughout this war, Iraq is being given bank loans from, particularly what becomes relevant, bank loans from Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. I'm quoting here from an online article, Saddam Hussein's Rise to Power. Ronald Reagan supported Iraq during the war. He and other American leaders were worried that the religious fundamentalism of Iran's government might spread throughout the Middle East. Kuwait, Iraq's small neighbour to the south, also sided with Iraq. Kuwait's government, like Iraq's, was controlled by Sunni Muslims who wanted to prevent Iran's Shiites from gaining too much power in the region. The Kuwaiti government loaned billions of dollars to Iraq during the war. 1988, the war ends between Iran and Iraq without victory for either side. It essentially ended in a stalemate. And in 1989, the war has ended a year earlier. Tension begins. Tension particularly begins between Iraq and Kuwait. Now remember, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, these other Middle Eastern countries want to see Iran defeated. But they don't want to go to war with themselves. So what they're going to do is loan Iraq money, and then Iraq is going to fight Iran. So you get to 1988, Iraq hasn't been able to have a solid victory against Iran. That war ends, and Kuwait wants their money back, essentially. And Iraq says, hold on, I wasn't just fighting to protect myself. I was fighting against Iran to protect Kuwait, to protect Saudi Arabia, and all of these other countries. So why do I have to pay back the money you loaned me? He doesn't feel that's fair. So there starts to be this tension arise between Iraq and Kuwait in 1989. Iraq does not want to pay back the loans it took out from Kuwait to fund that war, or from other countries as well, including Saudi Arabia, but particularly Kuwait. And it had another issue with Kuwait. The economies of both countries rely on their oil fields. And there was agreements, OPEC agreements, that Kuwait or that any country in the Middle East would not sell above a certain quantity of barrels of oil, because if they did, they'd drive the price down. So through OPEC, they had come to agreements about the quantity of oil they would sell. Kuwait wasn't keeping to those agreements. It was selling so much oil to enrich itself. It had driven the price of oil down, and it was costing Iraq's economy, I think they estimated, about $1 billion a year. So there's also the oil issue. Another issue Iraq highlighted. If this is the border, and this is Iraq and Kuwait, they accused Kuwait of something called slant drilling. So this is an oil field in Iraq, and there's some oil. And here's an oil field in Kuwait. They'll have their own oil fields. But Kuwait had learnt to do something. Over here they'd build a drill, and they'd learnt to slant drill. So they're taking oil from Iraq's land by driving the pipes sideways. And they were essentially stealing Iraq's oil. So Saddam Hussein had logical reasons to get more and more frustrated with Kuwait. Leaders from both countries met on several occasions during 1989, but never reached an agreement. Iraq-Kuwait relations became even more strained. In the Rumaila oil fields, Iraq insisted that Kuwait had developed advanced drilling techniques capable of this slant drilling. According to Iraqi officials, Kuwait's use of slanted drilling allowed the country to steal over $2.4 billion in oil. And in 1989, Iraq demanded repayment for the lost oil. Kuwait, Saudi Arabia and other countries had loaned Iraq money to fund its war with Iran. Now they wanted their loans repaid. But Saddam Hussein believed his war restrained Iran and protected the rest of the Arab world from a fundamentalist Islamic State power, and Saddam Hussein wanted the loans forgiven, as he had fought on behalf of all of them. But Kuwait would not forgive the loans. Then there's the OPEC agreement. The agreement that they would not release more oil to drive down the price per barrel. Oil prices had been over $20 a barrel in early 1990. Had been $20 a barrel. By early 1990, they were down to just over $13 a barrel. Every dollar drop in the price per barrel cost Iraq an estimated $1 billion per year. So every $1 drop, so really $7 billion a year, $1 billion per dollar drop. So Saddam Hussein is becoming more and more frustrated with Kuwait. And he starts testing the waters to see whether or not he's going to be able to go to war with Kuwait without the United States or the West or any other country preventing him. He comes to the conclusion that it's safe to do so. And it appears that the United States, whether they intended to or not, at least at the time gave him the impression that they would not interfere in any of these Middle Eastern politics. So in 1990, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait. Quickly takes over the country. And now begins all of those politics within the US government. How do we respond? At first, many people didn't want to get involved, but then they started to see the issue. By taking over Kuwait, Iraq now controlled 20% of the world's oil supply. This is quoting President George Bush. Iraq's invasion of Kuwait posed a geopolitical oil crisis. Our jobs, our way of life, our own freedom, and the freedom of friendly countries around the world would all suffer if control of the world's great oil reserves fell into the hands of Saddam Hussein. So the United States, particularly individuals within the government and within the armed forces, start to push for a US response. But the public won't buy it. The public do not want a war with Iraq, especially over something as abstract as controlling an oil supply. They've come out of which war? The Vietnam War. They've come out of the Vietnam War feeling extremely burnt and seeing the damage and the pointlessness of war. And now when they see this conflict in the Middle East that looks like both sides may have a point, that doesn't directly impact the United States, the opinion of the population, the vast majority of the population, is why would we send our sons to die on that battlefield? So what they have to do is manipulate public opinion. And this happens in the history of 1991, and we briefly mentioned that. There was a 15-year-old girl from Kuwait, known only by her first name at that point in time, Naira. In the girl's testimony before a congressional caucus, well documented, you can go online and see the videos, she described how, as a volunteer in a maternity ward in Kuwait, she had seen Iraqi troops storm her hospital, steal the incubators, and leave 312 babies on the cold floor to die. 7 US senators later referred to the story during debate. The motion for war passed by just 5 votes. In the weeks after the girl spoke, President Bush Sr. invoked the incident 5 times, saying that such ghastly atrocities were like Hitler revisited. But just weeks before the US bombing campaign began in January, a few press reports began to raise questions about the validity of the incubator tale. Later it was learned that Naira was in fact the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to Washington and had no connection to any hospital in Kuwait. She had been coached, along with a handful of others who would corroborate the story, by senior executives of Hill and Knowlton in Washington, the biggest global PR firm at the time, which had a contract worth more than $10 million with the Kuwaitis to make the case for war with the US government. This is quoting Brent Scowcroft, Bush's national security advisor of the time. He said, "At the time, we didn't know that it wasn't true." He acknowledged it was useful in mobilizing public opinion. They recognized soon after that it had been a manipulated fabrication, but it was helpful to their campaign. In 1991, you have what was known as the Iraq War before 2003, and you have, we will call it the Gulf War, also known as Desert Storm. People within within the US military made the point in 1991 that they didn't want to just drive Iraq out of Kuwait. They had an agenda. And they spoke of that not just to drive Iraq out of Kuwait, they also wanted post-war leverage over Iraq. So they also wanted to decimate Iraq to such an extent that after the war was over, they would be able to control Iraq's affairs. Quoting one Washington Post article, Some targets, especially late in the war, were bombed primarily to create post-war leverage over Iraq, not to influence the course of the conflict itself. Secretary of State James Baker had warned that Iraq was going to be bombed back to the pre-industrial age, and the economic loss of the 43-day bombing campaign undertaken by the United States was almost $250 billion. They crippled Iraq's infrastructure, destroyed 134 bridges, 18 of their 20 power plants, industrial complexes, oil refineries, sewage pumping stations, telecommunication facilities, everything. They absolutely decimated Iraq, intentionally separate to just freeing Kuwait. The intention being to decimate the country to such an extent that it could be easily manipulated. So you can see why after this Gulf War Desert Storm, Saddam Hussein didn't easily forgive and he didn't go away. In fact, if you were to see the mess Iraq is in now, compared to what it was back in its earlier history, they decimated the country. This is quoting Colonel John Warden III, the Deputy Director of Strategy, Doctrine and Plans for the Air Force. He agreed that one purpose of destroying Iraq's electrical grid was that you have imposed a long-term problem for the Iraqi leadership that it has to deal with at some point. Saddam Hussein cannot restore his own electricity. He needs help. If there are political objectives that the UN has, it can say, Saddam, when you agree to these things, we will allow people to come in and fix your electricity. It's to give us a long-term leverage, just reinforcing my previous point. This is an article from CNN dated January 17, 2001, before 9/11. It's talking about that war. They quote James Baker. His warning that Iraq was to be bombed back to the pre-industrial age, the almost $250 billion damage that did within Iraq. And they say, they're quoting an analyst from the Moscow Carnegie Center, Dmitry Trenin. He says a lot of people sitting in Moscow would say this was the first time that the United States started to act as a global policeman, that there was no counterweight to the great might of the United States. Since then, Russia has endeavoured to maintain a level of influence in the region. As we said before, Cold War is ending, the United States is beginning to act in a unilateral fashion, and they begin to demonstrate that immediately. This was the first time the United States started to act as a global policeman. There was no counterweight to the effect of the United States, because there was no way that Iraq could go to the Soviet Union, who they'd also had an alliance with, and ask the Soviet Union to protect them. The Soviet Union was already, in the 1991 history, it was already crippled and about to die. So there was no restraint to the United States. So we have this early history, the beginning of our reform line. We often talk about Afghanistan and the Soviet Union. I want us to see that thread with Iran, Iraq, Kuwait. We talked about the Third and Fourth Diadochi War, one war with a break in the middle. So for time, we're going to skip through this really quite quickly. The Third and Fourth Diadochi War, also World War I, World War II, they're one war. So this is the war that causes Antigonus, our superpower, to go to war with the Allies. Prior to this, there had been no major conflicts between our allies and Antigonus. Antigonus, as well as the allies, had a common threat. There was this one common enemy that they all saw as a threat. And that enemy was a general known as Eumenes. So this is the history of the Third Diadochi War. There's been this ongoing war between Antigonus versus Eumenes. And at this point in the breakdown of Alexander's empire, there are two superpowers. It's a bilateral world order. Eumenes had the most specialist fighters that had fought for Alexander the Great. They were known as the Silver Shields. By the time they're fighting in Eumenes' ranks, they are men well into their old age. You're talking men in their 70s, but they were so highly trained, they were still the most formidable force that was, I suppose you could say, walking the planet at that time, or at least that part of Earth's geography. Those silver shields were fearful. They were what you might call today like the special ops team, or that class that's hard to get into, where they just go in and Navy SEALs. They were Alexander's Navy SEALs. They called them the Silver Shields. They were fighting on behalf of Eumenes. It made him extremely powerful. Antigonus also extremely powerful. They were the two most formidable generals, and they were going to head. They had been fighting in the time previously up to this point. There's a few different battles, we won't go to them. It finally comes to its completion. The final battle, it was the Battle of Gabini. Now in this battle, and the ones prior, Eumenes was fighting against Antigonus, but Antigonus had a couple of allies. There was a couple of other generals fighting on behalf of Antigonus. I wanted us to consider those two generals briefly. Eumenes was the most powerful general in the east. He controlled much of the eastern part of Alexander's empire, and he'd united the eastern satrapies all against Antigonus. He controlled the Silver Shields, Alexander's elite fighting force. But there are two other generals that are supporting Antigonus in this war. The first one was Seleucus. Seleucus at this stage did have Babylon, but he didn't have it to such an extent that they don't mark the beginning of the Seleucid dynasty here. We'll see it begins some years later. He did have Babylon, but it's not the beginning of his dynasty. We'll see he quickly loses it. And another general, Python. Eumenes unites the eastern satraps against Antigonus. He's expecting that Seleucus or Python might join him, but they don't. They continue to support Antigonus, and they make Eumenes' life hard. At one point, Eumenes was trying to conduct a river crossing, and Python and Seleucus catch him and they attack his forces. He just manages to get his whole train across the river. So we see in this history Antigonus being supported by these two other generals. Eumenes comes across Seleucus. Seleucus also attacks his army. Also, Python, just quoting here, after the second war of the Diadochi, we're now into this is the end of the second war, the Battle of Gabini ends the second war of the Diadochi. After the second war, Python was among the most powerful diadochi in the eastern part of the empire, and he started to build his power again. So that Seleucus and Python held a fair degree of power. They're supporting Antigonus, who's one of the two superpowers. At this battle, the Battle of Gabini, Eumenes and Antigonus go face to face. Eumenes charges Antigonus using what mode of warfare? What did we say was a characteristic all through the battles of the Fourth War and Pyrrhus? Eumenes charges Antigonus with elephants. This is why I made the comment. If we went back into the history, you would see the same mode of warfare you see at this battle, you see, or at 2016, 18, 19, 21, all of those where we see elephants as the mode of warfare, you can place it at the very beginning of our reform line. Eumenes charges Antigonus with elephants, but the elephants, they're charging across this dusty salt plain. And as the elephants are charging, masses of elephants, this dust cloud arises that blocks the view, and the two armies can't see each other. And Eumenes has made a very foolish mistake. He's left his baggage train unprotected. So as this dust cloud starts blocking the view of the enemies, Antigonus sends men all around, and he takes the baggage train. This baggage train, it was everything that the silver shields of Alexander the Great over the decades of fighting for Alexander and for Eumenes had ever earned. It contained all of their wealth, as well as their wives, their children, their families, everything. So Eumenes, he doesn't lose this war with Antigonus. There's no real conclusive victor in this war. But at the end of it, what Antigonus has is all of their baggage and all of the families of the silver shields. So this formidable force of Eumenes, they come to a deal, and they go to Antigonus and say, we've worked all of our lives, we want it back, what do we have to do? And Eumenes is given up by his own men. The silver shields surrender their general to Antigonus, who kills him, and Antigonus gives back the baggage train to the silver shields, and then punishes them for being traitors to their boss, and they all end up being killed anyway, somehow. So what I want us to see is this is the history, the beginning of the Fourth Diadochi War that we're going to line up with 1989. We will make some applications immediately, so that we can start to understand what we're doing with our limited time frame. You have two superpowers, it's bilateral. How is one overthrown? You have elephants. What do elephants represent? It's a type of warfare. We saw through the history of Pyrrhus, it's an information type of warfare. It's the mode of warfare. And through this information war, how does Antigonus manage to overthrow his opponent? From within. How is the Soviet Union overthrown? Daniel 11 verse 40 calls it a battle. But what does a battle look like? The Soviet Union was overthrown from within. Their own people gave up the government. So we have that history. And in this history of 1989, did the United States go into it alone? What does Time magazine tell us? What ally did the United States have in 1989 that they called the Holy Alliance on the cover of Time magazine? Pope Pius XII. Sorry, no, I'm stuck in World War II. Pope John Paul II. Can everyone see this bottom line? In the history of 1989, I'll save this for World War I. The history of 1989, you have a bilateral world order, two superpowers. You have the Soviet Union versus the United States. You see they take the baggage train at that battle, and the opposing superpower is overthrown from within. But the United States had two key allies in that history. And the two key allies, one was the papacy, John Paul II, and the second was the Mujahideen. We know that Time magazine article well. The front page cover, Reagan, John Paul II, and they called it the Holy Alliance. It's how John Paul II united with the United States to help bring about the end of the Soviet Union through the Solidarity movement, or to bring about the end of the Soviet Union by overthrowing it from within. So you have one superpower. Seleucus, what territory does he become king of? He's the king of the north. Papacy, king of the north. Then you have Python. Now also in this history, one of the ways that they weakened the Soviet Union to such an extent that the people were giving up on it, one of the ways they weakened it economically, perhaps the main way, was through the Afghanistan war. And who was fighting on the side of the United States in the Afghanistan war? The Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were used by the United States to prevent the Soviet Union from victory in the Afghanistan war. And they dragged it out for so long until it decimated the economy of the Soviet Union. But then we find Antigonus, after this second war comes to an end, he's been aided by Seleucus, by Python, the other generals have been his allies, all has been peaceful. Now how does Antigonus feel? He's defeated Eumenes, he has taken over Eumenes' territory, and all of a sudden he is by far the most powerful general since Alexander the Great. And he decides that he's going to unite the whole of Alexander's splintered empire underneath himself. So he starts going into other generals like the little guy's territory, and just either killing them or overthrowing them or forcing them into subjection under himself. He quickly starts to feel unhappy with Python, so he has Python killed. We read before that Python, after the Battle of Gabin, started to expand his power base and he started to become actually really powerful. What did the Mujahideen do after 1989? What organisation did they form into? Al-Qaeda. The Mujahideen formed directly into Al-Qaeda. They took over the government of Afghanistan in what year? 1996, the Al-Qaeda take over the government of Afghanistan. Antigonus has become dictatorial and he attacks Python and has him killed. I'm quoting here from A.T. Jones' Great Empires of Bible Prophecy. After the death of Eumenes, Antigonus considered himself master of all Asia and began to destroy all governors who possessed any considerable ability, of whom Python was one. He attempted to destroy Seleucus with the others, but Seleucus escaped and fled to Ptolemy. So he kills Python, and in this history, not just with Python, but you also have other generals that Antigonus is lording it over. You have Seleucus abandon Antigonus as an ally. What was the relationship between John Paul II and the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union? We began to discuss that. Previously. Quoting from Livius, Antigonus Monothalamus was the sole ruler in the east and the strongest of the Diadochi. Ptolemy was alarmed by the growth of his power, knowing that he would be unable to retain the independence of Egypt against the united forces of Asia or of Antigonus. The conflict between Antigonus and Ptolemy was not new. So Antigonus and Ptolemy have long had this tension between them. They've hated each other. But now Ptolemy recognizes Antigonus as being this great threat. Ptolemy writes to Cassander and Lysimachus. And the three men, Ptolemy, Cassander, and Lysimachus, all come into an alliance against Antigonus. And they send Antigonus an ultimatum, which reached him in the winter of 316. They sent him an ultimatum and they said all the money that he'd earned through his campaign against Eumenes was to be redistributed among them. And he had to also redistribute the land that he had conquered. Antigonus refuses to accept the terms of this ultimatum, and the Third Diadochi War breaks out, this being a war between Antigonus and the three allied forces. Python is killed. Seleucus abandons Antigonus, and then we have those other three generals send an ultimatum to Antigonus saying, redistribute that power. What are they asking for? Stop acting unilaterally. We want a multilateral world order with all the generals sharing the spoil. Antigonus will not accept that type of world order. The three unite against Antigonus, and Antigonus immediately seizes the initiative. He invades Syria to secure Phoenicia with its naval resources, which were needed for anyone who had to invade the Aegean world. And in the summer, Antigonus lays siege to Tyre, which had become independent but was supported by Ptolemy. So he's making a direct attack on the sphere of influence of Ptolemy. So you have an ultimatum and then war. You have an ultimatum and then Antigonus invades the sphere of influence of Ptolemy. And remember, we said the war over the spheres of influence. And now as we enter the Third Diadochi War, who is Ptolemy? The king of the south. So we have to close now. I think we've finished the time we're allowed to have this hall for. So I'm just going to make a quick application. The Battle of Gabini, we lined it up with 1989. The world at that time goes from bilateral to unilateral. Antigonus has two allies, Seleucus and Python. We see the papacy and the Mujahideen. Python starts to become powerful. The Mujahideen formed Al-Qaeda, took over the government of Afghanistan, become powerful. In 2001, we see after 9/11, the United States blamed Al-Qaeda, the government of Afghanistan, and they invaded who were previously their allies. Overthrows the Al-Qaeda government of Afghanistan. In this history, the alliance between John Paul II and the United States is completely destroyed. We don't have time to go into that now, but it's interesting how it so quickly crumbled. With this history, you see an ultimatum between three allied forces saying to Antigonus, stop behaving in this dictatorial fashion, redistribute the power you have gained. And in 2003, as this war intensifies, you have three powers. It was Britain, France, and Russia. We already said this ultimatum, you had Cassander, Lysimachus, and Ptolemy, king of the south, Ptolemy, king of the south, Russia. And they go, send an ultimatum to the United States, and they say, you're not allowed to invade Iraq. The UN won't let you. If you attempt to do it through the power of the UN, we're going to block you. And we see that Iraq, as a sphere of influence at that time of Russia, the United States invades anyway against international law, beginning this conflict between Russia and the United States, between other countries and the United States, but particularly between Russia and the United States, that was sparked as a result of the Iraq War. This is where becoming more familiar with our history can be quite helpful. We understand that through those, and there's good documentaries that we should all be familiar with, it was the Iraq War that turned Vladimir Putin against the West, and everything he's done since stems back to that Iraq War. He never forgave America for breaking international law in that fashion. And now when they say, Vladimir Putin, you invaded Ukraine, how dare you? He says, you invaded Iraq. I'm not breaking any laws you haven't already broken. So his sticking point, what he holds against the United States, all stems from the Iraq War. This is the beginning of the explanation of the Third Diadochi War, and we will need to close now. If you'll kneel with me, we'll close in prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for our blessings. Thank you that you offer us such a clear understanding of where we are in world history. We know that you do nothing unless you tell your servants. Lord, I pray that we will have faith in these things, that we know that we are living through, we can see, Lord, the world can see, atheists can see, everyone can see that we're living through momentous times in Earth's history. Thank you that we need not go through it blindly. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to understand your truths, understand your methodology, and have a clear concept of where we are and what is coming in the future. Please prepare us for this in heart and mind. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.